Hello, my name is George Hopkinson and welcome to Emotional Breakthrough, a bridge between psychedelic-assisted and traditional talking therapies. And this is a presentation about my research project, and it also marks the end of my 2-year counselling MSc at Bangor University. So I really hope you enjoy my presentation. If you'd like to read my handout, then please follow the link in the description of this video. And if you have any questions at all, please type them into the comments and I'll try and answer them as best I possibly can. So I'll start by asking the question that really inspired this project, and that is, how does psychotherapy actually work? And if you'd like to pause the video and take a few moments to write down some answers to this question, then please feel free to. What I found is that this seemed to be a seemingly simple and straightforward question, but I found it really difficult to answer when I looked at the research. I found, while there's loads of research that demonstrates that psychotherapy is effective and produces therapeutic changes, and also loads of research into the components or features that make up effective therapy, things like relational depth or empathy, I really struggled to find research into this middle section, the psychological mechanisms or processes that go on in someone's mind that really lead to a positive therapeutic change occurring. And I thought it was really interesting and I wanted to find out a bit more about it. At the same time, I was getting really interested by psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or PAP. And if you're not familiar with this, it's a combination of talking therapy and a psychedelic drug dose. And there's some hugely promising research demonstrating its effectiveness to reduce the symptoms of a load of psychological conditions, such as treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. But what I was really interested in is the amount of research that the field of PAP has done into the explanations of how and why it works. So not just that it is effective, but exactly what are those psychological mechanisms that it facilitates. And one of them was put forward by Roseman and colleagues in 2019, the psychological mechanism of emotional breakthrough, or EB. And this was defined in their paper as the experiencing and overcoming of challenging emotions and the subsequent emotional release. And their research demonstrated that greater levels of EB predicted greater levels of well-being after a psychedelic substance had been experienced. And ultimately, they concluded that EB was a key mechanism for understanding how PAP worked. And when I was reading about it, it didn't seem especially new to me, this idea of experiencing and overcoming challenging emotions and the subsequent emotional release. In fact, this felt like something I'd experienced as a client of therapy. And Roseman colleagues also came up with the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory, or EBI, and this is a scale specifically designed to quantitatively measure EBs, and it uses this 0 to 100 analog scale you can see at the bottom of the screen here, and involves 6 questions that people have to answer. I won't go through all of them, but just to give you an idea, one of them is, I experienced a resolution of a personal conflict or trauma. Another, I felt able to explore challenging emotions and memories. And so again, this didn't feel like a new thing. This felt like potentially these emotional breakthroughs that are being talked about in PAP are also happening in therapy rooms around the country and around the world on a daily basis. And so I wondered if that was the case, and that really kind of led me down the path towards this project too. It also didn't seem like EBs were an entirely new thing for the psychotherapy literature. So across my counselling training, I'd read a lot about emotionally visceral experiences being really important for facilitating positive personality growth from Carl Rogers. And I'd also read about the importance of cathartic release of emotion from Brewer and Freud. So it seemed to be that perhaps emotional breakthrough was being talked about by 2 of the most influential psychotherapists of all time, but just using slightly different language. And this to me was a real sign that maybe they did exist and they were occurring in talking therapy, but just being talked about in a slightly different way. And all this collectively led to my research question. Do EBs occur for individuals during traditional talking therapy? And in turn, my 3 hypotheses. Firstly, simply that EBs occur in traditional talking therapy. Secondly, in line with previous PAP research, that the occurrence of EBs positively correlates with mental well-being. And finally, considering the concept of EBU was derived from psychedelic experiences, I hypothesized that EBs are more likely to occur for those who have experienced a classic psychedelic substance in the past. So to conduct the study, I used a correlational design, firstly just to observe EBs, and secondly to see if they had a relationship between, if there was a relationship between EBs and mental well-being. Simply put, this involved finding a load of participants and inviting them to complete an online questionnaire. And the participants I invited were those who'd experienced 6 or more sessions of talking therapy, so they had an idea of what therapy involved and had a chance to experience an emotional breakthrough. And optionally, they'd experienced a classic psychedelic substance too, so we could test that third hypothesis. And I recruited the participants from Bangor University, across social media and via the Psychedelic Society and the BACP Research Notice Board. The online questionnaire was quite straightforward. It gathered data on people's experience of talking therapy, their experience of psychedelic substances, their well-being using the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and emotional breakthroughs using the EBI that I've just talked about. Moving on to the results then, my first finding was that EBs do actually occur during traditional talking therapy. To understand this, the first thing I did was looked at the mean EBI score from all of my participants, and this could have gone from as low as 0 to as high as 100, and the score that I found was 60, average EBI score across all participants. And to ensure this was a meaningful value, I checked the statistical significance between this mean number and the number 0, and found that there was a 0.1% chance only that this difference had occurred by chance. And that gave me the real confidence that EBs had really occurred. They were actually there occurring during the talking therapy that my participants had experienced. Interestingly, the average EBI of the previous study by Roseman and colleagues after experiencing a psychedelic substance was lower than ours, so it was 43 compared to 60. That gives a little bit of context for 60, it could be seen as a baseline perhaps, but it is important to mention that these were different participants for each study and slightly different methods, so they can't be directly compared, but I'll come back to the implication of this. It certainly seemed to add to our confidence that EBs were an important facet of talking therapy. The second finding was that EBs are predictive of mental well-being. To understand this, I calculated the correlation using the Pearson test. And to explain this chart, you've got average EBI score on the x-axis and well-being by the Warwick-Edinburgh on the y-axis. You can probably get a sense from the distribution of the data, also from the orange trend line, and also from the R value on the right-hand side, that there was a medium strength positive relationship between the two. This was consistent with previous PAP research demonstrating a similar relationship after participants had experienced a psychedelic substance. So the two are associated. As EBI went up, well-being changed, which was really interesting too. For the third hypothesis, this was actually proven to be wrong. Unexpectedly, we found that EBs were no more likely to occur for historic psychedelic substance users. To understand this, I statistically compared the means between the group of participants that had experienced a psychedelic in the past, those on the left-hand bar here, with those who had never had a psychedelic substance in their past, those on the right-hand side here. And you can see the similarity in those EBI scores. What the statistical test showed us, the t-test and the p-value on the right-hand side with that 0.7 value, is that there is not a significant difference between the two. What this suggested is that EBs really occur entirely independently of any history of psychedelic substances, and that was really interesting. I'll come on to a bit more about that in a moment on the next slide. So the implications of these findings are that EBs absolutely may be one of the psychological mechanisms that explain how and why psychotherapy is effective. I can't be certain of that yet. More research will need to be done, but there's 4 reasons to have confidence in that kind of theory or suggestion. The first is that, as mentioned, EBs have been demonstrated to be a mechanism in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy research, and now we've seen the same mechanism occurring in traditional talking therapy. Now, it could be that it's operating, EB is appearing in talking therapy, but it's not operating as a mechanism as it is in PAP, but the two things aren't totally different. So it seems like a good sign that that is what's going on. Secondly, whilst the causal relationship hasn't been demonstrated, the design of the study didn't allow for that, this association between EBs and well-being is still really encouraging and suggestive that perhaps EB is one of these mechanisms. But again, more research is needed to understand. Thirdly, as I mentioned on the previous slide, because EBs seem to occur entirely independently of any historic psychedelic experience, it suggests that psychedelic substances are not needed for them to occur, and therefore perhaps EBs are a mechanism of the talking aspect of PAP. Maybe that it's the talking that causes EBs and not the psychedelic drug at all. And fourth, as EBs occurred with greater magnitude during this study than compared to the previous Roseman research, whilst not directly comparable, it's another sign that EB's magnitude was greater for talking therapy, and therefore it's a really important component of psychotherapy, traditional talking therapy as well. So, if EB is one of the psychological mechanisms of talking therapy, this really supports the theories of emotional visceral experiences and cathartic release that I spoke about earlier. And potentially even what EB does is it brings these two concepts together and describes them under a new term. So perhaps, yeah, Rogers and Freud, Brewer and Freud, I should say, were on something. They were really noticing this as they described it in their theories, and perhaps what they were talking about was what we're now seeing as emotional breakthrough in this research. So real support that Rogers' theories and Brewer and Freud's theories were correct back all those many decades ago. So collectively, this really implies that there's a unique value in exploring emotions with clients during talking therapy. So practically for therapists, there are a whole host of techniques that have been argued to facilitate this sort of emotional exploration. So just to give a few examples from my reading and my practice, advanced empathy has been discussed by Egan and Rogers to do this. So by noticing the tone of voice or the body language of an individual and assessing perhaps what emotion they are experiencing, even if they don't have the words to describe that themselves. Another technique is the real simple one of being silent, with some research by Ladney and colleagues demonstrating that silence is often used by clients to just reflect on their emotions in the session. And lastly, the power of exploring one's own emotions, therapists being clients and seeking therapy themselves, because as Yalom describes, this is one of the most important aspects of psychotherapy training, precisely because it allows therapists to model the exploration of emotions for their clients as well. So there's these existing techniques, and there'll be many, many more. Have a look in the handout if you'd like to see some more examples as well. And I'm sure there's many, many more that you guys use to help clients facilitate emotional exploration too. And it's possible that in the future there will be some new EB-based frameworks that could be created that make this more possible in a more structured way, so a more structured approach to helping clients facilitate emotional exploration as well. So some huge potential for that in the future. Moving on to PAP research and the implications. Firstly, the findings really demonstrate that it's not all about the psychedelic substance. There's a huge amount to be said about the talking component of PAP too. And that's particularly relevant if we want to improve psychedelic-assisted therapy to be as effective as possible. We won't be able to do this if we ignore the talking therapy element and just focus on the psychedelic. This research really does support that. And ultimately, this reinforces the idea that it's the psychological process that's really important, not the drug, that facilitates it. The drug may do that, the drug may be important, but it's the process that the drug facilitates that's important, because it's that that leads to the positive therapeutic change. And so this liberates PAP in a sense from not having to be entirely focused on the psychedelic substance, and can focus on to the talking therapy component too. So while this study represents the first quantitative exploration of EBs, more research is needed to really understand if EB is a reliable psychological mechanism in talking therapy. One way to start exploring that is, as already mentioned, looking at this causality issue. So the findings they show a relationship between EB and well-being, but it's not a causal relationship that's understood just yet. So it could be that EBs lead to increases in well-being, it could be that well-being leads to EBs, or it could be that a third variable or multiple variables are actually influencing the two as well. So we don't know that yet. Future research would need to involve maybe experimental groups, randomized control trials, things like that, to isolate that and start to demonstrate causality. Also, one limitation really of the study is that we asked people to self-disclose or self-define their experiences of therapy, and that could have led to some inaccurate data. It's not always possible for a client to say, my therapy included this, my therapy included that. So to research further the components of therapy, or the type of therapy that's particularly effective at causing EBs, it could be really helpful to recruit therapists and ask them questions to get their perspective on what therapy included as well. And finally, there's a huge amount of potential to explore other variables using experimental designs. And just to come on to a few examples of what that might look like. Firstly, it'd be really interesting to understand, how does the content, amount, or timing of talking therapy influence EBs? In this study, we just looked at talking therapy as one thing, but obviously there's lots of different aspects of talking therapy that can change. So what would altering those variables look like, and how would that affect EBs? Secondly, it'd be really interesting to understand if anything else facilitates EBs. So we've looked at psychedelic substances in the past, and we've looked at talking therapy in this study, but perhaps meditation could do it, for example. Mae'r and colleagues have argued that meditation can evoke states similar to a psychedelic experience. So it'd be really interesting to talk to experienced meditators to find out if they experience EBs too. And whilst the Warwick Edinburgh is a really reliable dependent variable to understand well-being, it'd be really interesting to see how EBs influence things like the Core10 and PHQ-9 that are also used a lot by therapists. And finally, we didn't get that perfect correlation that showed, that EBI is entirely correlated in explaining all of the changes in well-being. So it'd be really interesting. That suggests that different mechanisms are also, or different factors are also there influencing well-being too. It'd be really, really interesting to understand what are the other psychological mechanisms that are involved in talking therapy. It's really unlikely that it's just EBs, and our Pearson's art value showed that that's unlikely too. So really interesting to understand some of those. A really good place to start is some of the other proposed mechanisms from PAP research, such as psychological insight, and I know some of the other speakers are talking about that at the conference, so it'll be interesting to see their studies and their results. So to summarise and to have a take-home message, there may be a unique value for clients to explore and overcome challenging emotions during talking therapy, and therapists are really well placed and have a range of techniques to facilitate this potentially powerful experience. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Please check out my handout if you'd like to find out more, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments.